The day my stepmother lost everything. She looked exactly the way I'd imagined she would for 2 straight years, pale, furious, and completely unable to understand how the game had turned against her. I was standing in the back of a crowded county courthouse when the judge glanced over a stack of documents, adjusted his glasses, and calmly confirmed that the foreclosure would proceed. Across the room, my stepmother, who we'll call Diane, looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her 2 sons sat beside her in expensive suits that probably cost more than my first truck, and for the first time since my father's funeral, none of them were smiling. The funny thing is, they thought they had won 2 years earlier. They thought they had buried me so deep I'd never crawl back out. What they didn't understand was that some people fight with their fists, some fight with lawyers, and some fight with patience. Me, I chose patience. My father wasn't a rich man by modern standards. He didn't own private jets or vacation homes. What he owned was something far more valuable, where we lived, 52 acres of fertile farmland that had been in our family longer than anyone could remember. I grew up working that land. I learned to drive a tractor before I learned to parallel park. I spent summers fixing fences, repairing irrigation lines, and listening to my father tell stories about our family. He'd always point toward the fields and say, "One day, son, all this will be yours. Take care of it better than I did." That land wasn't just property. It was history. It was identity. It was home. Then Diane entered the picture. My parents had divorced years earlier, and after my mother passed away, my father remarried. At first, I tried to make it work. I really did. But Diane never liked the fact that I existed. Every conversation felt like a competition. Every family gathering felt like an audition where I was expected to lose. Her sons, Trevor and Mason, weren't much different. They saw the farm the way investors see stock portfolios. They didn't see memories. They saw dollar signs. They didn't see family legacy. They saw development potential. My father was getting older, but he was still sharp. That's why what happened next never sat right with me. He got sick unexpectedly, and within a few months he was gone. Losing him felt like somebody had ripped the foundation out from underneath my life. I was grieving, exhausted, and honestly just trying to get through each day. Then came the will reading. Looking back, I should have noticed the confidence on Diane's face the moment she walked into that conference room. She wasn't grieving. She wasn't nervous. She looked like somebody showing up to collect a prize. Her son sat beside her whispering and smirking. Across the table, I sat alone. Then the attorney cleared his throat and announced there was an updated version of my father's will. An updated version. 3 words that changed everything. According to this new document, nearly every asset my father owned had been transferred to Diane and her sons. The farmland, the farmhouse, the equipment, the barns, the storage buildings, everything. I remember sitting there wondering if I'd heard him correctly. I asked to see the document. I read every page twice. The signature looked like my father's, but something felt wrong. The timing felt wrong. The entire situation felt manufactured. I started asking questions. When was this signed? Who witnessed it? Why had nobody mentioned this before? The attorney immediately shifted into professional mode. Legal terminology started flying around the room so fast it sounded like another language. Every question I asked received a carefully constructed answer that somehow explained nothing. Diane crossed her arms and leaned back in her chair. Trevor grinned like he was watching a comedy show. Then Mason delivered the line I still remember word for word. He looked straight at me and said, "You'll get over it. It's just business. Just business." That's how they described stealing a family's legacy. That's how they described taking away everything my father had spent decades building. I left that office with nothing. No land, no house, no inheritance, no realistic way to challenge a legal document backed by expensive attorneys. For months, I was angry enough to shake. Then reality arrived. Bills had to be paid. Life had to continue. I moved into a tiny apartment above a laundromat in the city. Every night, I could hear washing machines rattling through the floor. The place smelled permanently like detergent and old carpet. It was a long way from 52 acres of open farmland. I found work at a land surveying and records consulting firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to survive. More importantly, it gave me access to information. Public records, property maps, zoning applications, environmental reports, ownership histories. Most people think revenge begins with rage. Mine began with paperwork. For almost 2 years, I said nothing. I never argued with Diane. I never threatened anyone. I never hired investigators. I let them believe they had broken me. Meanwhile, they were making plans. Big plans. Expensive plans. Greedy plans. And one rainy Tuesday afternoon, while reviewing county development filings, I stumbled across a name that made me stop scrolling. Heritage Ridge Estates. The proposed location was my father's farmland. The moment I opened the file, I realized something important. They hadn't stolen the land because they loved it. They had stolen it because they wanted to destroy it and turn it into something that would make them rich. And that's when I finally saw the first crack in the wall they had built around themselves. Now, before I go any further, let me explain something, because this is where a lot of people misunderstand how situations like this actually unfold. According to standard procedure, large land development projects don't just appear overnight because somebody has money and a shiny brochure. There are layers of approvals, environmental reviews, zoning requirements, public hearings, and enough paperwork to fill a barn. From a legal perspective, owning land and being allowed to transform land are two completely different things. A developer can buy a property on Monday and discover by Friday that protected wetlands, endangered species, historical preservation rules, or infrastructure restrictions have turned their dream project into a financial nightmare. That's exactly why smart investors perform extensive due diligence before risking millions. But greed has a funny way of making people skip uncomfortable details. This is a psychological trap, the belief that because you've already won one battle, you're guaranteed to win every battle afterward. Diane and her sons thought the hard part was taking the farm from me. They never considered that the farm itself might fight back. And trust me, it was about to. The moment I saw those development plans, I stopped thinking like a son who had been cheated and started thinking like a surveyor. Most people would have focused on the will, on proving fraud, on trying to reopen old legal wounds. I looked forward instead of backward. If Heritage Ridge Estates succeeded, the farm would disappear forever. If it failed, everything they had built their future around would collapse. So I started researching every inch of that property with the kind of obsession only heartbreak can create. During weekends, I drove out to the county and spent hours reviewing archived environmental assessments. I pulled decades-old agricultural records. I compared historical aerial photographs. I cross-referenced conservation maps with development boundaries. Little by little, pieces started coming together. Then I found the first problem. A section of the property contained seasonal wetlands that had existed long before my father ever owned the land. They weren't obvious from the road. Most people would drive right past them. But regulators don't care whether something is obvious. They care whether it exists. Then came the second problem. Wildlife reports identified several protected species nesting near the eastern portion of the property. Then a third issue surfaced. Historical surveys referenced remnants of an early settler trail that crossed part of the acreage more than a century ago. Individually, none of these discoveries would necessarily kill a project. Together, they created something developers fear more than lawsuits: uncertainty. Investors hate uncertainty. Banks hate uncertainty. Government agencies practically manufacture uncertainty for a living. I spent months organizing evidence. Photographs, maps, reports, field observations, archived records, expert references. Every document led to another document. Every answer uncovered another question. By the time I finished, I wasn't holding a folder. I was holding a weapon. Then I made my first move. Anonymous emails began appearing in very specific inboxes. Environmental review boards received detailed documentation. Historical preservation groups received evidence packages. Local journalists received tips regarding potential violations and overlooked environmental concerns. I never exaggerated anything. I didn't have to. Facts were more dangerous than fiction. The reaction was almost immediate. Questions started appearing at public meetings. Review timelines suddenly expanded. Additional studies were requested. Consultants were hired. Reports were challenged. More reports were commissioned. Every delay cost money. Every month cost money. Every unanswered question cost money. And Diane's family had borrowed heavily to finance the development. They weren't operating with cash. They were operating with debt. That's a critical difference. Rich people can survive delays. Borrowed money cannot. A few months later, I attended a county planning meeting and sat quietly in the back row. Diane was there. Trevor was there. Mason was there. They looked irritated but confident. Their lead consultant gave a polished presentation about economic growth, community expansion, and modern housing opportunities. Then public comments began. Environmental advocates stood up. Historians stood up. Residents stood up. Questions poured in from every direction. Wetlands, wildlife, water runoff, historical preservation, infrastructure concerns, traffic impact. By the end of the meeting, the confidence I'd seen on their faces had faded. For the first time, they looked worried. Good. They should have been. Over the next year, things got worse for them. Investors started pulling back. One financing partner withdrew completely. Construction schedules slipped. Legal expenses climbed. Public relations consultants were hired to control negative press. That effort failed spectacularly. Local newspapers loved the story. Wealthy developers attempting to pave over environmentally sensitive land was exactly the kind of headline readers couldn't resist. The project became controversial. Then it became toxic. Then it became radioactive. I heard rumors that Trevor and Mason were blaming each other behind closed doors. Apparently, every family discovers the limits of loyalty when money starts disappearing. Meanwhile, I kept working my regular job. I paid my rent. I minded my business. Outwardly, I looked like a man who had moved on. Inwardly, I watched every filing, every permit application, every financial disclosure. That's when I discovered the real opportunity. The development loans were becoming distressed. The bank wasn't panicking yet, but it was nervous. From a legal perspective, lenders care about one thing above all else: recovering their money. Sentiment doesn't matter. Excuses don't matter. Results matter. Heritage Ridge Estates was no longer producing results. It was producing problems. So I requested a meeting. I didn't present myself as an angry heir seeking revenge. I presented myself as an investor interested in distressed assets. Technically, that wasn't even a lie. The bank representatives were exhausted. I could see it immediately. They had spent months trying to stabilize a project that refused to cooperate. When discussions turned towards selling portions of the debt portfolio, I listened carefully. Then I made an offer. It wasn't a generous offer. It wasn't supposed to be. The project had become a liability. Eventually, after weeks of negotiation, they accepted. I walked out of that process holding something far more valuable than ownership. I held the debt. That's when the game truly ended. Diane and her sons didn't know it yet, but the board had already been cleared. They continued scrambling for financing. They continued searching for investors. They continued telling everyone things would improve soon. But mathematics doesn't negotiate. Deadlines don't negotiate. Debt certainly doesn't negotiate. Payment notices began arriving. Extension requests followed. Additional restructuring proposals appeared. None solved the underlying problem. They owed money they couldn't repay. The final default happened quietly. No dramatic explosion. No screaming match. Just paperwork. Lots and lots of paperwork. According to standard procedure, foreclosure actions follow a defined process. Notices are issued. Deadlines are provided. Opportunities to cure defaults are offered. Every requirement was followed. Every document was accurate. Every signature was legitimate. Ironically, the same legal system they had hidden behind years earlier was now moving against them with machine-like precision. The courthouse hearing arrived on a cold morning. I remember walking inside feeling strangely calm. I expected triumph. What I felt instead was clarity. Diane entered with her attorneys. Trevor and Mason followed behind. They looked older than I remembered. Stress does that. The judge reviewed the record. Arguments were presented. Objections were raised. But facts are stubborn things. The debt existed. The default existed. The procedures had been followed. The law was clear. At one point, Diane actually turned toward me and said, "You planned this." Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. I looked back at her and answered honestly, "No, you planned this. I just paid attention." The room went silent. A few minutes later, the ruling came down. Foreclosure approved. Property transferred. Case closed. Just like that, the farm came home. Trevor exploded first. He started shouting about conspiracies and betrayal. Mason threatened lawsuits. Expensive lawsuits. Aggressive lawsuits. The kind of lawsuits people threaten when they can't actually afford them. Their attorney looked like a man desperately wishing he were somewhere else. Diane simply sat there staring at the table. I think that was the moment she finally understood what had happened. They hadn't lost because I was stronger. They lost because greed convinced them they were untouchable. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. Questions flew from every direction. Cameras followed them across the parking lot. Headlines appeared within days. The failed development became a local cautionary tale. Investors avoided them. Business partners avoided them. Lenders avoided them. Their reputations collapsed faster than their finances. And through all of it, I never celebrated publicly. I never gave victory speeches. I never mocked them. I simply drove back to the farm. The same gravel road. The same fields. The same horizon my father used to stare at after long days of work. The barns needed repairs. The fences needed attention. Nature had reclaimed parts of the property, but it was still there. The land had survived lawyers, developers, greed, and bad decisions. As I stood overlooking those fields, I realized something unexpected. The best part wasn't that Diane lost. The best part was that my father was right. The land wasn't just property. It was a future. And after everything that had happened, that future belonged exactly where it should have been all along. A lot of people hear a story like this and immediately focus on the revenge. I get it. It's satisfying. There's something deeply entertaining about watching arrogant people fall into a hole they dug themselves. But honestly, that's not the part that stays with me anymore. What stays with me is how close I came to letting anger make my decisions for me. For months after my father's death, I wanted a fight. I wanted dramatic courtroom confrontations. I wanted somebody to admit they had wronged me. I wanted justice to arrive quickly and loudly. Instead, life handed me something much less exciting and much more effective: time. Looking back now, I think that's why so many people lose battles they should win. They become obsessed with immediate revenge. They want emotional satisfaction before they want actual results. Meanwhile, the people they're fighting are busy making mistakes. The lesson here is that patience isn't weakness. Patience is often the most dangerous strategy in the room because impatient people reveal themselves. They cut corners. They get greedy. They convince themselves they're smarter than everyone else. Diane and her sons didn't lose because I was some kind of mastermind. They lost because every decision they made was driven by short-term profit. They saw 52 acres and imagined luxury homes. My father saw 52 acres and imagined future generations. That's a very different mindset. From a legal perspective, one of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming ownership automatically means control. It doesn't. There are environmental regulations, zoning requirements, financial obligations, and countless other realities attached to property. A piece of land isn't just an asset. It's a responsibility. Ignore that responsibility long enough, and eventually reality sends a bill. Another thing I learned is that greed creates blind spots. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere, not just in inheritance disputes. Once people believe they've won, they stop checking for risks. They stop asking hard questions. They stop imagining worst-case scenarios. They become overconfident. And overconfidence is expensive. The ironic part is that if Diane and her sons had simply respected my father's wishes, they probably would have walked away with comfortable lives and stable finances. Instead, they wanted everything. And when people become obsessed with getting everything, they often end up losing more than they ever expected. These days, when I walk through those fields, I don't think much about courtrooms anymore. I think about my father. I think about the lessons he taught me while fixing fences and repairing equipment under the summer sun. He used to say that land remembers how it's treated. Back then, I thought he was talking about farming. Now I think he was talking about life. Respect what you've been given. Protect what matters. Don't sacrifice the future for a quick payday. Maybe that's the real ending to this story. Not revenge. Not victory. Responsibility. So now I'm curious what you think. If you discovered your family inheritance had been taken from you under circumstances that felt wrong, would you have fought immediately, or would you have played the long game? And do you think Diane and her sons got exactly what they deserved, or did things go too far? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And if you've ever witnessed greed tear a family apart, I'd love to hear your experience too. Sometimes the most valuable lessons don't come from winning. Sometimes they come from watching what happens when people believe they're entitled to everything. And trust me, those lessons tend to last forever.